Just very quickly, I mean, disasters often cost millions, if not billions of dollars. You've acknowledged there is this policy you implemented to sign off on contracts that exceed $100,000. Why add extra red tape when there is a crisis of this magnitude?
It's not extra red tape. It's making sure everything's getting to my level and that it's immediately responded to. This was not slowed down at all. In fact, it was much more responsive. If you remember, I was there. I was standing right there long before this report ever came out, and people were asking and we were granting permission in real time. So the false reporting has been something that is inappropriate, and it's something that I think we need to clear up, and that this response was by far the best response we've seen out of FEMA, the best response we've seen out of the federal government in many, many years, and certainly much better than what we saw under Joe Biden.
Okay, I want to give you a chance to respond to Senator Chris Murphy, Democrat, who said this on X. He says the floods ripped through Texas on July 4th. On July 5th, FEMA received 3,000 calls from survivors. Only 1% went unanswered. That night, he says Trump and Noem fired the people who answered the calls. So on July 6th, FEMA received 2,363 calls. 65% went unanswered. July 7th, 85% went unanswered. He ended by saying sick. Were people fired who could have been helping at the time?
It's an absolute lie. And that's what I think is so disingenuous and horrible about the situation. Nobody was fired. No contracts were ended. Everybody was there answering calls and doing all they could to help the people of Texas. So the fact that Democrats are politicizing this while people are still looking for their babies, they're still looking for their family members, I think is absolutely despicable. And the American people just, I think, need to know the truth of what they're doing and how they're taking advantage of this situation to help themselves politically. It's a disservice not just to the people of Texas and these families that are going through grief right now. It's a disservice to our country.
The Houston Chronicle, a major Texas publication, had some scathing words for our nation's Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, comparing her handling of the flooding in Kerrville and the president's response to her handling of it to the botched government response to Hurricane Katrina during the George W. Bush administration. So I live in Houston, so the Chronicle is where I get a lot of my own local news. So I see stories in there all the time that I think are notable, but sometimes it's hard to gauge what's relevant or interesting to a national audience versus just a Texas or even a Houston audience. The Chronicle is decidedly, I would say, left-leaning in its bias, but I think it still does a good job generally of reporting on facts first. So this piece, though, was an op-ed, and it was written by just the editorial board of the Houston Chronicle. It starts off by highlighting all of the things that everyday Texans are doing to give back to the victims and their families, and Texans do that. This is a very typical response from the people of Texas after a tragedy. I know that some characters on the right are trying to make it seem like this is somehow a partisan issue and that people on the left aren't doing anything to help the victims or their families. It is just not true. I went to dinner over the weekend in Rice Village, and the restaurant said that a portion of their sales were going to Kerrville. It's just everywhere. But then the piece dives into what the government, as opposed to the everyday people, has done, or rather has not done, in response to Kerrville. It said that penny pinching undermined disaster response, citing reporting from the New York Times saying that FEMA laid off workers at a disaster assistance call center just days after the Kerrville flood, resulting in thousands of calls from victims seeking assistance to go unanswered. It said leaving disaster victims on hold isn't government efficiency, it's heartless.
In fact, her boss just spoke to NBC News' Kristen Welker about it. We don't have a recording, but here's the transcript of what he said when Welker asked, there are these reports that have come out that Secretary Noem, I guess, had to have signed off on FEMA expenditures, and they may have delayed some of the response. Trump responds, quote, I don't know anything about it. We were right on time. We were there. In fact, she was the first one I saw on television. She was there right from the beginning, and when she would not have needed anything, she had the right to do it, but she was literally the first person I saw on television that morning when we all woke up and saw this tragedy that took place during the evening, and she was right on the ball. She's done a great job. She was on TV.
They called attention to the 72-hour delay when FEMA was trying to respond to the flood, but could not because Kristi Noem, despite Republican attacks on bureaucratic red tape, enacted an unnecessary barrier to victims receiving timely federal aid. And while Texans can and often does respond to local issues within our own state, Governor Abbott had to seek aid from the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, which taps into a state-to-state network. And on that, the piece pointed out, you know things are bad in Washington when Governor Greg Abbott is publicly thanking California Governor Gavin Newsom. And then the authors drew a comparison between Trump praising Noem's response to the disaster and George W. Bush praising his own FEMA director after the botched response to Hurricane Katrina. Given the compounding scandals, Texans can be forgiven for any flashbacks to FEMA's disastrous response to Hurricane Katrina. It doesn't help that, like George W. Bush's infamous FEMA director Michael Brown, acting head of FEMA David Richardson lacks a real background in emergency management. Even the president's typically sharp tongue seems to have been replaced by embarrassing Bushisms. Trump's claim that Noem was right on the ball is just his version of, "Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job." It ends with a call to action and a warning saying Texans will do all we can to help our neighbors, but only our representatives in Congress can call Noem and Richardson to testify, much like they did for Michael Brown, to ensure FEMA is better prepared for the next flood, because there will be another flood. And that last bit is something that Texans know all too well. You don't have to tell us twice. When the flooding happened in Kerrville, we had started hearing about it here in Texas seemingly right when it happened, within 24 hours, if I recall correctly. And it started off as just a story you would hear about bad weather across the state. And, you know, we get a lot of bad, weird weather here. I remember what it felt like that day, though, here in Houston, which is a good, by the way, 4 to 5 hours away from Kerrville. But a lot of times, whatever is coming our way hits the Austin area first. So we never got a storm here. But I actually did say to someone that day that it felt ominous. Like it was overcast and very breezy all day, like something was trying to blow in. But even with the breeze and with the cloud cover, the heat was like oppressive. It was sweltering, heavy, and you typically get that very specific kind of heat right before a very big storm. And I know it's always hot in Houston, but I can't explain it. It just feels different. But then as the details started to come out, it became clear that this was far more than just your typical Texas summer storm. The death toll was initially staggering, but then it just kept rising. The story was getting picked up nationally based on the severity of the storm alone, but then the response to it, just the initial emergency response, and then the government's defenses of that emergency response began to dominate the headlines. We got the typical response from our Republican state government that there would be no investigations into what went wrong, that there would be no accountability, that only losers ask about what went wrong, and here in Texas we're winners. I don't know, that one was weird. Then we started hearing about the failures of the emergency response. People who weren't alerted in time of what was coming, people who were alerted but didn't act quickly enough. We heard about how local officials there had lobbied for better flood preparedness and emergency response systems in the past. And then we also heard that they were denied what they had asked for. And then we heard about how FEMA tried to respond to the crisis in their typical way, but could not. They were kneecapped in the name of cost-cutting and cost-saving. Our new hyper-efficient government was so concerned with saving money that right before all of this happened, Kristi Noem enacted a new rule that required her personal sign-off on any FEMA expenditures over $100,000, which, by the way, is nothing. FEMA can run up tabs worth billions of dollars in no time because that is how costly these disasters are. But the way it works is you do what needs to be done in the moment and then you deal with the bill later. The idea was always that saving lives was the priority. But since so many people now believe in our country that it should be run as a business, money is the stated and accepted priority. The government is no longer governing people, it's creating wealth and it's managing wealth, and people are often the greatest obstacle to wealth in the sense that people cost money. Their healthcare, their homes, their education, their safety, etc. All of it costs the government money that it would apparently just rather keep for itself or funnel into our military. With money as the top priority, people can more easily be demonized for even expecting their government to spend money on them, even though that is what governments are supposed to do. It's not handouts, it's the government governing. That's why we give our money to the government. That is why we pay taxes. That's the deal. You run the programs for us, and we will help fund the things that we want and need as a society. Anyway, the obvious and predictable final boss in all of this is the conspiracist. The cloud seeding is what did it because, as I said in another video recently, Occam's razor, never heard of it. It's clearly a coping mechanism for people who cannot accept reality, but it's harmful in that it distracts from the actual catalyst or catalysts of the crisis and any realistic possible preventative measures. It only feeds online trolls and it preys on the desperate, and it weakens the reality of what's happened to these victims and their families. But perhaps the worst part of all of this is that as our leaders attempt to explain away failures and deflect blame and refuse accountability, and as our people look for answers in all of the wrong places, the ironic result is inefficiency. So much talk, so little action, and we're just going to go through all of this again when the next disaster inevitably strikes. So hopefully we can figure this all out before that happens, but in the meantime, that is it for me. If you got anything out of this, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more. Thanks.